Boker Tov, Aryeh Green in Beit Shemesh. How are you, Aryeh?
Boker Tov. Good morning and good afternoon to you there in Australia. Very nice to be here with you, John.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you on Jury Duty. And can I ask you, what is your jury duty?
Just jumping right in. Well, it's because obviously there's an expansive definition of the way that you've phrased and conceived this idea of jury duty. But I have felt since I came to Israel 40 years ago and became more observant, Orthodox, if you have to put me into a particular box, modern Orthodox at that. I have seen my duty very much as part of what I would call the third wave of Zionism. If the first wave of Zionism, the first 100 years of the last century was uh, um, working to create a Jewish state, and the second wave of Zionism in the next 50 years of the last century was to build up the institutions of that state and defend that state, physically in terms of the battles that we fought. I think the third wave of Zionism now in the 21st century has very much been in promoting and defending the state on intellectual levels and campuses, political realm, and culture wars that we're having, and now we're back to physically defending. Well, we've never really
Mm.
stopped physically defending it, and so I see very much my duty, which has been expressed in all sorts of different ways, and work that I've done. I worked in the Prime Minister's office, as you know, here in Israel, and in high tech and in different social enterprises, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But the idea of promoting and defending Israel in all forums, political, academic, on the ground, physically, and elsewhere, I think is very much kind of one of the centers of my understanding of my role, which includes promoting Judaism and explaining Judaism to non-Jews, and also, I guess, to a certain extent over the years, promoting the greater tolerance and openness and understanding and love between Jews and among Jews. So that may be a little bit of a multifaceted response, but I kind of off the top of my head, that's how I see my duty, my jury duty, kind of shaping up.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your jury duty. It's clear that you have invested decades with the love and the passion that you have for the Jewish people and for the state of Israel. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm sure that your work has helped countless people and countless members of the state of Israel and the Jewish world. So thank you so much for that. And I do look forward to learning more about it and sharing that with my community. So before we look at your contributions directly, I'm wondering if you could tell us about your background and your Jewish educational background.
Sure. It's the problem with these kind of conversations, and we can go on for hours. I know we have some sense of a time limit. I remember when I was writing my book, I kind of had to parcel out a lot of the descriptions of my background because it's so multifaceted. But let me truncate the answer with the following kind of quick biographical information. So I grew up in a Reform, liberal Jewish family in California, and not very observant, but very strong. With a very strong Jewish identity and Jewish and American identity. I'm actually a direct descendant from one of the first Jewish families to have come to North America. My family came to North America in 1690.
Wow.
Uh, and I'm a direct descendant of the man who was called the Patriot Rabbi, Gershom Mendes, who was the first American-born leader of the American Jewish community, who was
Mm,
very much fiercely championing and supporting the Revolutionary War.
mm.
And there's stories to tell, but I don't want to go on. He actually was one of the 13 clergymen who had participated in the inauguration of President George Washington
Oh
in
my goodness. That's
yeah. So
extraordinary.
so
Wow.
and I mean this is my great grandfather. Here just for fun because we have a visual
Sure.
medium. This is my family tree, which
Wow.
happens to be on the wall of my home here in Israel. And so I grew up with a lot of American and Jewish pride and understanding of the importance of the Jewish identity and the miracle of America and how terrific it's been to the Jews. But on the other hand, not observant really at all. But I had a bar mitzvah, went to Sunday school, what have you. studied Hebrew for an easy A in my UC Berkeley years at college. I actually then was thinking of becoming a Reform rabbi, and that's actually what brought me to Israel, was the
Mm,
first year of rabbinical school as a Reform rabbi. But there are other stories to tell, which I won't go into, but eventually within that first year, I decided I did not want to be a Reform rabbi. I became more observant
mm,
within the context of living here in Israel and immersing myself in the Jewish community here. So I became more observant and decided and basically became Zionist. I didn't grow up in a Zionist household or community. San Francisco, California is one of is a strong Jewish identity community. And
mm,
in the years I was growing up there in the 70s was not necessarily a very Zionist community. It still has its anti-Zionist or
mm,
anti-Israel contingents, but thank
mm,
God both it and the Reform community in the wider circumstance across America has become a lot more obviously supportive
mm.
of Israel. But so I caught the bug. I decided to throw my lot in with the Jewish people in this wonderful experience of our renewed sovereignty in our ancestral homeland here in the land of Israel. And so I decided to stay. So my Jewish education, which was the, the the question that you asked, basically didn't stop there because becoming Orthodox, I then continued to learn both in different frameworks and on my own over the last 40 years that I lived here in Israel in terms of classes here and there. And I was at the yeshiva for a little bit and what have you.
Mm.
But I see my life here in Israel as a continuous journey of learning, including within the Jewish context.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure it's very challenging to distill such a rich history, both American and Jewish, in terms of your identity and your strong connections to both places, America and Israel, into such a short response, given the passion and the connection you have. And that's an extraordinary lineage that you can trace back to 1690 to the Patriot Rabbi. I don't know anyone who can trace back that far personally. So that's really wonderful and amazing that you have the family tree up on your wall there. So, my understanding is you've contributed to Israeli society and to the Jewish world in a myriad of ways. And I know we'll only be able to touch upon some of those today. But I'm wondering if you could highlight for us some of your Jewish professional passions and take us through some of the key experiences and contributions that you've given over the years.
Well, I would start by reiterating what I said about just being here in Israel, because I do feel as a Zionist, as very much within the context of what Rav Kook talks about concentric circles of identity and commitment and responsibility. You know, myself having made the decision to live here in Israel, to be married, to raise a family, and built two communities, including building two synagogues in two different communities here in Israel. The work that I've done in every facet. I've worked in education, I've worked in Hasbara, in promoting Israel, I've worked in the Prime Minister's office, as I mentioned, I've worked in high tech, and my current work we'll come back to in a minute for the last 10 years, working to bring renewable energy to Africa in a company that's based in Jerusalem. All of these things are part of kind of what I would consider the Zionist enterprise. I actually remember and have always believed in and kind of took with me a message that was relayed to us by the CEO of the first high-tech company I worked for. This is 30 years ago in Tel Aviv, where he was a former Air Force pilot. You know, one of these that now it's ubiquitous, but back then in the early 90s, it was still kind of a new thing that
Mm,
the military hotshots, you know, would come up with interesting new technologies and create companies and these startups and the startup nation. It was the beginning of all of that. And this CEO's name was Benny Hanigal, which in Hebrew means Beni Hanigal,
mm,
meaning my son who has been redeemed. He was the son
mm,
of Holocaust survivors. Just
yeah,
fascinating stories. Each topic that we enter into could be another story. But he said that high tech business in Israel at that point, which had just begun to overtake tourism as the country's main foreign currency earner,
mm,
that high tech basically is the new Zionism. If we talk about the
mm,
third generation of Zionism, the idea of moving from building up the institutions of the state to creating a flourishing, blossoming society, which includes obviously something like the recent $30 billion exit by Wiz, having been bought out by I guess it's Google. Who bought them? Apple? I forget who bought them. It doesn't matter. Um, the idea that Israel is going to be a superpower of technology in the 90s was still a kind of an initial kind of dream. It was just
Mm,
beginning to happen. And what Benny said was, this is the new Zionism.
mm,
We're no longer plowing the fields to provide for our people. We are creating new technologies, which include, of course, some of the most amazing medical and agricultural and other technologies which are helping the world in themselves, but also in terms of helping the country to be successful.
mm,
So my entire career has been kind of part and parcel of that. I've never worked. Thank God, I've been lucky enough. My father taught me when I was young, find something that you love to do,
mm.
and find a way to get paid for it, and then you'll be happy all your life rather than working to make money in order to use that money on leisure activities. And
Mm,
I've been very lucky that virtually my entire career has been made up of different kind of social action enterprises. Some more directly when I was training students how to promote or defend Israel on their campuses abroad. Thousands of students coming to Israel every year on exchange programs, whether I was working in an educational center, working in government. I
mm,
spent also 10 years running a project that trained the foreign press, the foreign media who were based in or visiting Israel, how to report more accurately from the field. I mean, it's not social action in the sense of helping people, but in the sense of
yeah,
working for the benefit of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. That was a wonderful experience, and very important as a contribution
yeah.
to getting the truth out.
Mm,
And then
basically.
he comes full circle to now the last 10 years. I've been working with my friend Yosef Abramovitz, and a wonderful team at Energia Global, or Gigawatt Global, which is a company, as I mentioned, based in Jerusalem, which is building solar fields in sub-Saharan Africa. And talk about Jewish social action. I mean, this is a combination. It's a for-profit company. We've actually just opened a nonprofit arm
Hmm.
also to help support our activities, but bringing renewable energy to the most vulnerable communities on the planet,
Amazing.
especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We also are actually working now in America and in a few other areas, and you'd be surprised the rural agrarian communities of the American South, are for their,
Mm,
relative to the rest of the American economy. And you have the same thing in Australia
mm,
and elsewhere. There are unfortunately um, poor people, poor communities, vulnerable communities across the world. And
mm,
we really believe that bringing renewable energy as a source of both power and economic development, and the provision of health services and clean water and jobs and women's
mm.
empowerment, what have you, it's just all tied up. Energy basically drives human and economic progress.
Yeah.
And so that definitely, even though it sounds a bit far-fetched to say this is a Jewish, social action project, it very much is. And
Oh,
and so I'm
very.
very proud to be doing that for the last 10 years.
Very much so. I would say that this is an embodiment of tikkun olam, of healing and fixing the world. And we know that with climate change and global warming, the desert areas of the world have only expanded, and access to fresh drinking water has become more scarce and more difficult for many peoples to reach. So this is truly an incredible initiative based on social action, and based very much on Jewish values. So it's extraordinary that you can help some of the most vulnerable communities. And we know that there are many phrases from both Jewish tradition and Western traditions that speak about a society being judged by how it treats its most vulnerable and most vulnerable communities. And so the fact that rather than turning a blind eye to these vulnerabilities, you've created an organization, Energia Global, that actually helps these communities directly is incredible. And what I really appreciate even more is that you're looking to the future in terms of the solar fields, the renewable energies, which really also is a way of diversifying the sources of energy for these communities into sustainable sources. So it's extremely important what you're doing. And thank you. I would definitely say that is a significant jury duty among your many contributions. I would love to ask you more about some of these contributions. You mentioned that you worked in the Prime Minister's office. Would you tell us a bit more about that?
So I've been very, very lucky in my career to have worked with some very prominent and just amazing individuals, leading the pack without question, is Natan Sharansky,
Yeah.
who, as I'm sure you and many of your viewers and listeners know, was a leading dissident in the Soviet Union, working with Andrei Sakharov and the human rights movement there, and a leader of the movement of the Zionist Aliyah movement from the Soviet Union. And he was imprisoned, and he spent 9 years in the Soviet Gulag, and eventually was released and reunited with his bride, where they were separated a week after the wedding,
Oh,
in Jerusalem. And I, in fact, coincidentally, was one of the thousands of people who danced him down to the Kotel on his arrival in
wow.
Jerusalem, and found myself 10 years later privileged enough to work with him for a decade,
Mm.
both in his party, the Israel Ba'aliyah
Hmm.
party, and then in the prime minister's office with him. And I was responsible with Natan, on the one hand, to talk about the kind of work that we've been talking about, the Jewish social action, defending Israel, what have you. I was responsible for helping to promote and defend Israel. He was Minister of Diaspora Affairs and Minister of Jerusalem. He was also Minister of Social Welfare, if we talk about social action.
Hmm.
And one of my focuses, one of my responsibilities was to help to coordinate programs to promote and defend Israel in Jewish communities abroad, as well, or in particular on college campuses. In fact, Natan was the first minister of the state of Israel to take not just one, but actually three dedicated trips abroad to visit college campuses. In other words,
Wow.
many ministers, including prime ministers, when they came to America or to Australia, would give a talk, a speech
Mm.
at a prominent university.
Mm.
But the idea that an Israeli minister would dedicate a 2 or 3 week trip to visiting dozens of universities across America and Europe. We never got to Australia. I apologize to you and your listeners. It was on our planning board, but for various reasons, well, because of the disengagement where Natan resigned on principle from the
Yeah.
government, that cut short that particular term. But so that was one of my responsibilities, and in fact, I brought Natan to about 65 campuses in uh, in America and Europe.
Well, if I could interject, I actually didn't miss out on meeting Natan Sharansky because I was at the Hebrew University for a semester in 2004, 2005, and there was a Shabbaton arranged for students at Rothberg International School where I was. And so I did meet Natan Sharansky as a student of the Hebrew University. So there
I,
you go. It doesn't surprise me that he worked in campuses. I did meet him in that context in Jerusalem.
I'm curious, what year was that?
End of 2004.
2004. Well, it would have been me. That's very funny. It's
Yeah.
exactly the year that I was with him in the Prime Minister's office from 2002 to 2005. So
Oh,
that would we might have met,
we
Gemma,
may have met in Jerusalem many years
but
ago.
your focus would have been on him. The senior advisor who brought him in and walked him out would not have been your.
Well,
In
I
any
just
case,
remember the amazing atmosphere because there were students from around the world who were studying at Rothberg, mostly from North America, and the respect that people had for him and for wanting to hear his story and to understand what he sacrificed in order to promote and to stand by his values in relation to Judaism and Zionism were truly inspirational. And I remember the energy being really something special because people could see that this person's actions matched his words, and that in some situations can be unique. And so I think that was really something that shone through. And I remember this sense of people feeling genuinely very inspired and moved by him sharing his story. So
well,
thank
that's
you for
that
organizing
that's
it. It's a great memory. So thank you for
no,
arranging that for me. I've waited 20 and a little bit years to say thank you.
I will happily relay that to him. He enjoys hearing about the impact he's had. Well, the truth is that was only one of my responsibilities. My other was to connect Natan to activists who were promoting democracy and freedom in Palestinian society and throughout the Middle East, in Syria and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and Egypt and elsewhere in Jordan. And for me, that has, but both of these activities have continued. I speak frequently on college campuses. And in Jewish communities on these topics, both in terms of promoting freedom and democracy in the region, and obviously defending Israel in various different ways, and combating anti-Semitism. But that was for me a unique experience within the uniqueness of working with Natan over the course of a decade, and then in the Prime Minister's office, because it was again the first time that an Israeli minister um, took an active role and articulated the understanding. In 2004, it was George Bush who read his book, The Case for Democracy, and gave it a plug, and brought it to even more prominence. The book that he wrote with Ron Dermer, who's today a minister in the Israeli cabinet. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu was one of the first Israeli leaders to back then have recognized the importance of Natan's basic principle that democracies don't make war with other democracies. And therefore, if we want real peace in the region, what we have to do as a free society is to promote the development of other free societies. And we can see now, obviously, with 30 years later, how 20 years later, sorry, how true it's been. If we needed any more proof, I mean, within the context of both what was called the Arab Spring, which it wasn't, and efforts in Iran of their people to rise against their tyrannical regime, and everywhere in the region, including, of course, in Palestinian society, the need for the people themselves to take back the reins of power from these autocratic, very, very dictatorial regimes. It's just even more clear now than it was 20 years ago when he wrote the book and started talking about it. And that for me has been a very important theme of the rest of my both work and my extracurricular activities and my public speaking, because it's a very funny joke that we used to say. I speak frequently, but my name is not known. And we used to joke about saying, you can have Natan Sharansky with the charisma and the weightiness of his personality and his public stature come and speak to your community or at your college campus or in your church. Or you can have Aryeh Green, and everybody obviously wants Natan Sharansky, but the difference is that you can actually understand Aryeh Green when he speaks a lot easier than Natan. And I say this with a smile because Natan himself is aware that he has a wonderful and yet very heavy accent in both English and in Hebrew. And so it's become a kind of a running joke. You
Yes.
also actually pay. You pay a much lower honorarium when you have Aryeh Green speak than when Natan Sharansky comes to speak. But anyway,
Well, you can rest assured that I have backed that trend because I have interviewed you first, and I haven't interviewed Nathan Sharansky yet. But if you wish to let him know that I'd be very happy to interview him, I will let him know that indeed I did interview you first.
I'll happily connect you. And so,
Thank
that was my experience in the Prime Minister's office. And what's interesting is, it's amazing the time frames we're talking about. I mean, I just saw a video of Bibi Netanyahu when he was 28 years old and speaking, I think, in the UN.
you.
And I mean, and that's 50 years ago, I mean, or so. And so, but he was finance minister in Ariel Sharon's cabinet when Natan was the diaspora affairs minister. And I had the privilege, again, a number of different dozens of interactions and meetings. And it's so interesting that the difference in public personality and public perception of so many of our leaders. I mean, you could say the truth, whether it's about Trump or Biden or Obama or Netanyahu or Sharon or others, that both the public persona, which is the way they present themselves, but also the public perception, which is the way the media and others present them, can be so different than when you're actually having a human interaction with somebody. In fact, I just saw, maybe you saw it too, Jim, that Bill Maher just had a dinner with President Trump. We're talking about last week. This is very,
Right.
very topical. You might watch. He has a 15-minute segment. Bill Maher does on where he reports about his dinner with President Trump. And one of the things he says, he's Mr. Liberal. I mean, he's against woke culture. He's against kind of the takeover of public discourse by the far left, but he still is absolutely a liberal's liberal in terms of policy analysis, and a moderate liberal in terms of his ability to consider other possibilities and debate them
Mm,
between liberal and conservative policy alternatives. But he basically says, I'm just in a half a sentence saying what he says in 15 minutes, which is actually worth watching. I would encourage you and the others who
mm,
are watching or listening here. What Bill Maher says is basically that Donald Trump, the person, is a
mm,
mensch.
mm,
He's a mensch. He's a nice guy. He's willing to listen. He laughs. He's self-deprecating.
mm,
And Bill Maher himself said that he then watched this same person
mm,
on give a speech like the next day or that
mm,
night, and he asked himself, so wait, what happened? This is not the same guy that I sat and had dinner with last night. And it's a
mm,
very interesting aspect of our reality. But I was just saying that about Netanyahu, who, of course, is demonized by so many, criticized rightly by some, criticized wrongly by others. Reasonable
mm,
people can debate the policies that the Israeli government's pursuing at any given time. But he is denigrated and demonized by so many that
mm,
I just have the memories of very um, enjoyable and reasonable interactions with him as an
mm,
individual back
mm,
then, when we were there. And that's an important element to keep in mind when
mm,
having, especially online
mm,
policy debates where people allow themselves to kind of go off in the deep end,
mm.
um, casting aspersions on people's characters instead of focusing on
Sure.
the issue.
It's so interesting what you say, and I think of Shakespeare's quote, and apologies if I misquote it here, but all the world is a stage, and many people do have this personal persona and the professional persona that can come across quite differently in order to achieve their policy goals and in order to present themselves in a particular way. So it must be very fascinating as someone who has personal connections with different politicians across the Israeli and even American political spectrum to know people personally and to really have that sense of who they are as individuals. And I think it's a very valuable perspective and one that is important for us to remember to humanize all our leaders and realize that we must keep policy discussions about policy because if we want to have the best outcomes for societies, we really need to you almost use the chevruta system of asking questions and honing them with more questions to really find the kernel of truth and of what's most important in policies, which means that we shouldn't be distracted by people's personalities. But of course, there are significant issues that sometimes can be raised, on the other hand, from people's personalities that many in the public space consider relevant in choosing their leaders. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess it can go both ways. So can I ask you, if you're looking at the current situation in Israel, we obviously know that there's a lot of division, whether it be political divisions or religious divisions, and the war has both added new layers to this tension and exacerbated existing tensions. What would you say are some of the most significant issues going forward in Israeli society, and can you propose any solutions to them for that people watching could enjoy hearing about?
Ah, I mean, the obvious. I'll leave aside the obvious in terms of the war that we're still in the middle of, and the implications and importance of understanding the strategic elements of that war. It's not Hamas, it's Iran, Iran and nuclear ambitions. It's important that we all engage and are active. And I said I was going to put it aside, but I will say one word about that.
Sure.
In fact, you know what? I'll go ahead and focus on that. I think that the main challenge that Israel faces today is the challenges to its legitimacy in terms of the intellectual arguments in the media and political circles and in academic circles, as I was mentioning before, in terms of the legitimacy of Israel's existence and, of course, its right to defend itself. But all of that ties in and is given practical expression in the war that we're now engaged in against Hamas and on and off with Hezbollah, but more importantly, the conflict at the strategic level with Iran. I think that our community, those who are listening or watching this conversation, and in the wider sense, those who care about not just Israel, but care about freedom and democracy and peace in the world. I mean, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, but this is what I learned from Sharansky. It's absolutely true that it's not just that Israel, the peace of Israel, the peace of the world
Mm,
basically rests on the expansion of liberal democratic, open, tolerant freedoms within societies which are now ruled by dictators, and for a very simple reason that those dictators have always sought external enemies to justify their repression at home.
Yeah.
And therefore, once a more free and open society is developed, the leaders of that society have to provide benefits to their own society in terms of food and jobs and health services and general welfare in order to be reelected.
Mm.
And therefore, they have a vested interest in doing so and not in making war, because war is the most destructive thing to any modern society. So, having said that, um, our responsibility as Jews is basically the same as our responsibility as human beings and as members of free societies. And that is to promote in every way possible, whether it's in op-eds or arguing with academics or in terms of our voting behavior,
Mm.
promoting those voices in the world that are going to not only support Israel and Australia and the rest of the free world in our struggles against the autocratic dictatorships
Mm.
that threaten, our civilization, but very specifically, there is the added element of the violent and repressive nature of Islamism. Of course, I don't mean Islam, the religion. I mean the political interpretation of Islam, which we call Islamism, which is focused on the rejection of not just Israel and the Jews, but Christianity and anyone who they see as infidels and who they see as it's a mitzvah, that it's incumbent on them to wage war against and kill as many as possible, Jews, Christians, Westerners, or what have you. And that doesn't just start and end with Iran. It includes Turkey, the current leadership of Turkey and Qatar, and even those that we consider to be on the more moderate side, like Saudi Arabia. We have to stand up to these things. Now, this isn't a call to, bomb,
Mm.
to nuke Iran, but it is a call to at least be aware that that's what we're dealing with.
Mm.
And even if we were to negotiate another agreement with Iran, we being the Western world, it's important to remember that these are regimes which don't keep their agreements, which have no intention to keep their agreements. And so, yes, I sound like a hawk when it comes to national security, and that's because we have to be, I think, realistic in looking at the record of these dictatorial, oppressive Islamist regimes, and not pretend or try to convince ourselves, as some do, that if we make an agreement with them, they'll keep it, that their goal is peace and economic development, which it isn't. Their declared goal is the destruction of Israel and America and Australia and the Western way of life, and the replacement of them by a Sharia-led Islamist kind of world order,
Mm.
which I think that we can reasonably see as one of our primary goals as Jews and as Australians, Americans, and human beings. Our primary goal is to oppose that in every way possible, which starts on the intellectual level and the public advocacy level, and the pro-Israel advocacy level and activism, and may unfortunately end up requiring military action, and we should be supportive of that too. So I'm sorry to be a little bit harsh, but you
I'm
asked.
I did ask. I'm glad I asked. And I would say you don't sound like a hawk. From my perspective, you sound like a realist because you're simply calling it as it is. You're outlining and identifying the current political situation, and we know this to have been the political situation for decades in various forms. So this shouldn't be news to people, and I think for people who watch the region, it isn't news. I know that back in 2010, I went to the World Expo in Shanghai, and I went into the Iranian stand there, the Iranian presentation hall. And I remember seeing that they had as their main point that they wanted to show a small model of their nuclear reactor, and above which was a map of the world without Israel. And they were very proud of this. This was what they displayed to the world as their presentation when they could put anything up there at all, the natural wonders of Iran, of the people, the rich history that they have. But this was really their main focus. And so your point about these autocratic societies finding external enemies to justify the repression at home is, in fact, simply the reality of these societies, of the governments of these societies. And I think it's naive of us to think otherwise and to put our heads in the sand and think that that we can ignore the risks of Islamism and so on. So thank you for elucidating that. I think it's extremely important. You mentioned Iran, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. I did want to ask you about normalization with Saudi Arabia and with other Arab states. Do you see it to be a likelihood that the Abraham Accords will be expanded soon to include Saudi Arabia and then by extension other Arab states?
Absolutely. In fact, just to combine the two topics, well, that's why you asked. There is obviously a connection. I wish I knew who actually invented or who originated the quote, but I'm sure you're familiar with the quote that a liberal is simply a conservative that hadn't been mugged yet, or something like that. You know, the life experience that we have informs the way that we view the world.
Yes.
And I think what you said is very important. You know, whether it's Israel or whether it's America and its partners in Afghanistan or Iraq, whether it's Al Qaeda and 9/11, whether it's all the other experiences that the West has suffered. You know, we have historical, and by historical I mean current, not going back, but it does go back hundreds or thousands of years. But certainly in the last decade and two, we have the evidence of what we're up against. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk, negotiate, try and work things out. Obviously, I already said we should be promoting the societies themselves in becoming more open and tolerant. And hopefully they will either elect or overthrow the current leaders and elect new leaders. But so it doesn't always mean military action. But I think that issue of realism doesn't mean we give up our values of peace, tolerance, openness, humanity, and acceptance. It just means that we, as you said, recognize who we're dealing with and what we're dealing with. So having said that, I think that whether it's the United Arab Emirates or Morocco or Sudan or Bahrain, and I've been to Bahrain, I've been to the United Arab Emirates since the Abraham Accords, I think there's no question that the leaders of those communities basically did just that. In other words, they combined this recognition of how dangerous the extreme forms of Islamic interpretation, which we call Islamism, this Islamist, jihadist, violent rejection of everything Western or Israeli or Jewish or Christian or whatever, how it threatens themselves. So that's a realism, but it combines also with their own much more moderate, and I'll call it normative, or at least acceptable traditional Islamic understanding theologically, philosophically, of the importance of tolerance and peace and acceptance. I mean, in fact, that's the topic of my new book about the whole issue of how we can bring real peace to the Middle East, is through that kind of a transformation in Arab and Muslim society. And that is what the United Arab Emirates and the others have led. They've led a transformation in viewpoint, in attitude in their own societies, not just towards Israel, but towards Israel, Jews, Christians, and the West, in recognizing that not only is it important for their own security and or development, economic, social, human development, but also in terms of a return to, or at least a recognition of and a promotion of a more tolerant and moderate view of Islam. And so, yes, I definitely see that occurring. There are all sorts of geopolitical, strategic, issues that come into bringing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, and others as well. And it's an irony to a certain extent that the more moderate Arab Muslim countries that may be, and by the way, there are non-Arab Muslim countries, some of them we're working with in Africa, Muslim majority countries who are ready to join the Abraham Accords, that we, based in Jerusalem, are working with their governments to build solar fields in their countries as part of a embrace between them and Israel. But what's ironic is that there are countries who are, quote, who are seen, quote, unquote, as allies of America, like Turkey and Qatar, who in fact are more Islamist and extremist in their jihadi opposition to Israel, America, and what have you. Even Turkey, a member of NATO,
Mm,
is led by one of the more extreme Islamists in the
mm,
region.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I do see an expansion of the Abraham Accords coming, and it's an irony of history. I think there are others, again, I can't remember who originated this quote, but the idea that only right-wing conservatives can make peace and only left-wing liberals can make war, it's been true in Israel in terms of Menachem Begin, who was supposedly, the right winger who signed
mm,
the first peace deal that Israel ever had with an Arab country, with Egypt.
mm,
And that it was the left-wing leaders like Rabin or Golda Meir or others that
mm,
carried out most of Israel's
mm,
defensive military operation. It's certainly kind of an irony of history that it's Donald Trump who
mm,
is who's successful with the original Abraham Accords and maybe in office as the Abraham Accords are expanded, whereas the Democratic leadership of America was not either involved or able or willing to pursue that as a policy preference. But
mm,
um, I don't know if that's really true in Australia or other countries, because unfortunately, as we've noticed, there's a perhaps an overbearing focus on America in a lot of these discussions.
mm,
But I think it's unfortunately been true that the more liberal wing, call it the left of the Western political system, has seen negotiation as a strategy rather than as a tactic. And unfortunately, because of that, there's been less of a willingness to try new things and or to be
mm,
strong on defending our way of life and our principles. Um, and therefore there hasn't been quite the same movement. One of the very interesting things about the Abraham Accords is there was an explicit recognition by the president, I think, or the prime minister of the United Arab Emirates at one point, a recognition that Israel is here to stay,
mm,
and therefore there was a there was a principled acceptance that the Jews have a place in our region
mm,
and that peace can be made between Muslims and Jews, but there was also a practical element to recognize that Israel's not going anywhere, so we might as well, accommodate ourselves to their existence and cooperate with this burgeoning, flourishing economy, what have you, instead of always fighting it. And that going back to our discussion of realism,
mm.
um, that issue obviously became also part of the Abraham Accords, and I think it's an important element that we can and should recognize.
Yeah. Oh, you've mentioned so many fascinating things, and I have so many questions to ask, but I really want to reflect on what you said about the perception of right wing and left wing, that Begin made peace with Egypt, and then Rabin and Meir were associated more with wars, and now we have Trump, who, the leader of a right wing government who has created these Abraham Accords, and hopefully they will be expanding. So you did mention how the left sees these as strategy, whereas the right sees these as a tactic. And it's a really interesting distinction, a subtle distinction, but really significant. And I remember a similar conversation when I was in Israel in 2004 and 5, around the time of the Hitnadkut, the time that Israel withdrew from Gaza, and that Ariel Sharon, who had been known as a hawk, was indeed the prime minister who removed the settlements from Gaza. And we see significant, obviously, follow-up effects now from that policy. So it rings true what you say, and I think it's really significant. And it's also fascinating what you say about the alliances that America has with Turkey and Qatar, for example, recognizing that there's geopolitical considerations here, even though that they have leanings towards more jihadist ideologies. And I imagine it's a very a fine tightrope sometimes walking that balance between these alliances, which America needs in the region, versus not somehow strengthening these governments simultaneously when they have these jihadist considerations. Can I ask you, what do you think weighs the balance for America in having these strong relationships with Turkey and Qatar? Do you think there is anything that can threaten these alliances, or do you feel that they're very strong despite the jihadist ideologies?
The truth is, even though I have a master's in international relations, I don't consider myself really kind of able to to go really in any real depth in terms of predictions about where things can lead. But I will say this: um, a realistic. We've now keep returning to this element of our modern world and how we view it. A realistic perspective on Turkey and Qatar as two examples um, has to suggest that the alliance with them is temporary, benefits them a lot more than us being the West, and cannot go on indefinitely.
Mm.
There are too many areas of dispute, areas where we're just not in sync, and
Mm.
that's putting it mildly,
Mm.
between the Western alliance and the Western world and Turkey and Qatar. And so one of two things will happen, and this is where I can't predict it, but either their people will overthrow these autocratic regimes, and Turkey can return to its secular roots, and Qatar can focus on enjoying the spoils of its underground oil, um, and their societies and their governments and their regimes will undergo a transformation, or the alliance between them and the West will break down.
Mm.
What does that mean for the future? That I'm refusing to predict, but I will predict that as long as Erdogan is in power, his articulation of his goal to rebuild the Ottoman Empire should not be ignored by
Mm.
Western leaders. We've learned to our distress, all of us, but
Mm.
particularly the Jews and Israelis, have learned to take the statements made by leaders around us, whether it was Sadat before he became a man of peace, or whether it was Hitler, obviously, back in World War II, or whether it was the leaders of Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and Al Qaeda and all the other Islamist jihadists. When they say they're going to do something, that's what they're, and we can see by their actions, that's what they're pursuing. So let's not kid ourselves that that's somehow, no, nobody would do that. Nobody in their right mind would nuke Israel because it would, Israel would fire back and destroy half of their country. What we don't understand is that Iran, changing from Turkey and Qatar to Iran for a second, that Iran's leadership, for whatever twisted, ideology that they believe in, are willing to sacrifice half their country in a nuclear attack by Israel and the U.S. just in order to attack Israel with nuclear weapons. That seems factual. In the same way that Iran sacrificed 1 million of its own people in its war with Iraq and said that they were willing to do so.
Mm.
And so when we talk about Turkey and its ambition to reawaken the kind of or reestablish the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish hegemony over the region, that's a real threat to Israel, to the Western world, to the other nations here in the region, as well as obviously to the Western world. And so my prediction, if you will, is that they will continue to pursue those policies
Mm.
until or unless the Western world, led by America, Australia, Israel, and others in Europe, if they ever grow a backbone, that Erdogan will continue this very aggressive and hostile policy towards Israel, towards the West, until we stop him, and stop him either ideologically or intellectually or politically or economically or socially, or in the end,
Mm.
militarily.
Mm.
And that's, Qatar is not a military threat to its neighbors or to Israel or to the West, but it is an ideological one. The amount of money that they put into universities in America, the amount of money that they put into Al Jazeera, which is nothing but a propaganda arm of Islamist ideology, and
Mm.
yet, because it has taken as its mission to be a viable alternative for international English language news to the BBC or to CNN, it has achieved a lot of that on the English side. And the Arabic side, it doesn't even, its Arab language services make no pretense. Anti-Israel, anti-West, anti-America, anti-Australia. It's phenomenal that we tolerate, we even allow it to be broadcast in
Mm.
Australia, America, and elsewhere. Israel banned Al Jazeera a couple of years ago because of that, at the beginning of I think it was before the war with Hamas, but it might have been just after the October 7th.
Mm. I think you've mentioned so much, and again, we could talk about each of these topics in great depth. Again, going back to that point of being realistic, we know since the 7th of October, and we've known for decades that we can't ignore the threats, and we understand that when our enemies say that they have these intentions, it would be very naive of us to dismiss those. And you've made some really significant points in relation to, for example, Iran. Can I ask you, is Israel aware of the current state of the Iranian nuclear policy, nuclear development? And would you say that this continues to proliferate currently? And do you think that Trump will be implementing policies that will have a material effect to thwart those attempts?
Yes, 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 and yes.
Hmm.
Yes, they're
Yes.
continuing their policies.
Yeah.
Yes, it's of concern. Yes, we have to do something about it. Yes, I believe the Trump administration will continue to work towards disarmament and the reduction of their nuclear capability. What I don't know is how much and whether. I mean, Donald Trump himself is an unpredictable person and an unpredictable public personality, as we discussed earlier. And his policies, therefore, and the people who carry out those policies are also, to a certain extent, unpredictable.
Mm.
I, I'm going to suggest, as an observer, but not an expert, I'm going to suggest that the Trump administration will not be any more willing to allow Iran to continue to develop nuclear weapons than Israel
Mm.
will. The difference we had with the Obama and the Biden administration is that Israel has been consistent. And this has nothing to do with Bibi Netanyahu. It's true across the political spectrum in Israel for 40 years now, certainly for the last 20, that Israel will do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons.
Mm.
That simply is, it almost goes without saying, but it has to be repeated. And it's something that within the context of this kind of a conversation, when we talk about Israel's relations with the world, or the Israel's relations with the Jewish communities of the world, or individuals who are watching or listening to this conversation, it's something that I think many people, Jews and non-Jews, but who are supportive of Israel, don't really understand that the consensus in Israel. I wrote an article about this a few years ago. Send you a link if you want. The consensus in Israel hasn't changed for years
Mm.
across the political, and this is true for many topics, but right here we're talking specifically about Iran. You know, the media always obviously promotes the discord that exists, whether it's
Mm.
about judicial reform or whether it's about potential issues with the territories of Judea and Samaria and peace
Mm.
agreements, what have you. But really, the areas of consensus in Israel are vast, and one of them regards Iran.
Mm.
Almost all Israelis, and this includes Arab Israelis too, left, right, center, religious, non-religious, rich, poor, urban and rural, and kibbutznik, what have you, we all agree that we
Mm.
cannot allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. And even if that means that we have to militarily attack Iran and do it alone and suffer tens, if not hundreds of thousands of casualties to do so, I'm being very, very honest and blunt here. The consensus among Israelis is that that's what we'll have to do,
Mm.
because it's a very simple calculation. And I don't mean to be really, really almost inhumane about it, but suffering a few 100,000 casualties by a retaliatory attack by Iran is nothing compared to half the country being destroyed, all of our infrastructure being destroyed, and millions of people dying by
Mm.
a nuclear attack. We
Mm.
are fully convinced that if Iran has nuclear weapons, it will use them
Mm.
eventually. So we must prevent that. So in answer to your question,
Mm.
I do think that the Trump administration agrees with that basic principle. Whether or not it will pursue tactics
Mhm.
that will end up with Iran dismantling its nuclear capability, or that will end up with the Iranian people rising up against their dictatorial regime, as we discussed, or whether Israel and America would militarily attack Iran jointly. None of us know any of the answers to those questions.
Mm.
But the bottom line issue, we seem to be in sync at this point between Israel and the current American administration,
Mhm.
not to allow Iran to further develop their nuclear capabilities.
Mm. Thank you. It's obviously a major issue of our time and when we can't take our eye off. I wonder as well, looking from a strategic and tactical point of view, does Israel have strong alliances with other minorities across the Middle East who are also doing whatever they can to preserve their own safety? And could these minorities be meaningful allies either through the Abraham Accords, they're recognizing they may not be nation states, or in other less formalized manners?
In fact, much more so now than when I was involved for Minister Sharansky was connecting him to peace and democracy activists across the region. These were individuals or small groups that did not have necessarily a large following. Now, with the upheaval in the region, including the civil war and revolution in Syria, including various different activities in Iran, obviously the uprisings that did occur in Egypt and Tunisia and Algeria and elsewhere over the course of the last decade, the advent of social media, we now have, and we've seen, and we can measure the kind of popular support for not just Israel in general and its legitimacy, but for relationships with Israel and Israelis. You mentioned being at the official Iranian stand.
Yeah.
Well, I was at the World Expo in Dubai a few years ago and went to a number of different Arab and Muslim countries, national stands where countries with whom or with which Israel doesn't have relations. I went wearing my kippah. I went, with an Israeli flag on my lapel, introduced myself as, "Hi, I'm Aryeh Green from Israel with the Israeli contingent," and the warmth of reception by just both government and general people was apparent. Now, there were those who turned away
Mm,
and were unwilling to speak, sometimes out of ideology, sometimes I'm sure out of fear for
sure.
being seen to be speaking with a Jew or an Israeli or what have you. But we've seen that now across the board, especially in online relations. I mean, Israel's Iranian, or I should say Farsi, language radio service is listened to by, I would say, millions. I don't remember the actual numbers from the last survey. It was maybe a year ago, but certainly after October 7th. Um, but the numbers are in their millions of Iranians who listen to Israeli radio. And we've seen that on social media platforms across the board. There are communities within Iran and across the region, whether they are religious minorities in their countries, national minorities, or a combination, like the Druze, just
Mhm.
as one example. The Druze communities in Turkey and Syria, obviously, who are in touch with their brother, sister Druze in Israel and in the Golan, the
Mm,
Baha'is, whose main religious center is in Haifa, as you probably know.
yeah.
They various different other minorities, both religious and otherwise. I'm sure I'm forgetting some of them, but there's definitely no question that there is an openness. I wouldn't call it an embrace. I mean, an embrace is the word that I use to see what happened in the United Arab Emirates, just as one example, where the leadership signed the Abraham Accords, and through a whole campaign, which was educational and cultural and religious and what have you, the people of the United Arab Emirates, embraced Israel. The supermarkets had, stands, just your average local neighborhood supermarket with a stand with cherry tomatoes from Israel with an Israeli flag at the top, you
Yeah.
know, proudly presenting that this is from Israel, not either hiding it or boycotting it or what have you, as we've seen elsewhere, including in Europe and certain places in America and even Australia.
Mm,
Um, and so there's no question there is a rising tide of
mm,
both, I would call it moderation and
mm,
acceptance of Israel and Jews and the West and Christians, etc.,
mm,
across the region. The question is, when are these trends going to be so powerful that they will enter or capture or take over the government, the
mm,
reigning governance of these countries? I mean, that's what I've always said about the Palestinians. I was privileged to work with Arabs, Christians, and Muslims who self-identify as Palestinian and who are leaders in the communities who are promoting the kind of tolerance and acceptance, moderation that we've been talking about. I've always said that I'm confident that there will be peace between Israel and Arabs who identify as Palestinian and the wider Arab and Muslim world.
Mm,
The only question is this kind of emerging new tolerant Islam, which will then
mm,
enable this kind of transformation as it did with the Abraham Accords. The only
mm,
question is it going to emerge and start leading, as opposed to being a minority
mm,
voice, start leading these governments
mm.
across the region? Is it going to be in 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades or 2 generations?
Yeah.
We don't know. On the one hand, October 7th has accelerated that process, I believe.
Mm,
We've seen Arab and Muslim voices come out publicly rejecting that kind of barbarity. So it's accelerated the move towards moderation in the Islamic and Arab world. On the other hand, we've also seen, obviously, and even more so in the Western world, especially university campuses and what have you, Australia and mostly in America and Europe, that's accelerated the development of the supporters of Hamas and the
right.
supporters of jihadi, militant Islamism.
Mm,
So who knows? I would hope 2 months or 2 years is
mm,
reasonable. I'm afraid that it may be more like 2 decades, but it's a process that we have to encourage. We can't coerce it. But going back to what you asked, what we could do and what our listeners and watchers could do within the context of our duty as Jews, promoting, doing everything possible financially, politically, socially, on social media, what have you, to promote the emergence and the strengthening of the moderate,
mm.
accepting, more centrist, more tolerant version of Islam in Arab and other societies, I think is an imperative that we're way, way late in pursuing, and we all should be much more active in doing so.
Mm. Yeah, it's a fascinating range of comments that you've made about this and how the 7th of October both accelerated the process of modernization in some of the Arab countries while accelerating the process of support for Hamas and some of the more Islamist regimes in the West. And it's an interesting dichotomy that we're trying to understand globally and I guess work to mitigate. I would also imagine that the Kurds and the Maronites would also potentially have room for alliances with Israel. And of course, there's so many minorities across the Middle East that I share your sentiments that hopefully the tide will turn towards the more tolerant and moderate forms of Islam. If we can
Well,
turn, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I just want to say it's kind of funny, in these kind of conversations, sometimes you can't pull out the reference that you're thinking of. And there's no question the Kurds were at the top of my mind because as a national and ethnic and religious community, they are sizable.
Yeah,
And there has always been a connection between the Kurds in Turkey and Iraq and Syria
yeah.
with Israel, and not least because so many Jews from Kurdistan do live in Israel, and also not least because the Kurds themselves feel a certain kinship with the Jews and with Israel because they are a persecuted minority, ethnic, national, religious, however you want to look at it,
Mm.
across the region. So you're quite right. But sorry, Gemma,
Yeah.
you wanted to move on
No,
to another.
I also was thinking of the Kurds because geographically, where my understanding is a vast majority of the Kurds are located in the Kurdistan region, it does border with Turkey and with Syria. And so, what occurs in terms of Erdogan with his attempts to expand his regime and so on, and what occurs in terms of
Very
Turkey,
much
the
threatened.
civil war affects the Kurds very much. So, I would think that could be a meaningful alliance with Israel. And we know as well the Maronites reached out to Israel only recently in Syria when they were going through very difficult times as well. So I think there's certainly opportunities within the region for these alliances to be built. If we can turn to the war now, and I know you've mentioned that you're not in a position to predict outcomes, but I imagine that our viewers might be wondering your thoughts on what do you think will happen from here? Are there any ways for us to gain a sense of understanding in terms of strategy or tactics of the current government of Israel? What do you think we could be seeing in the coming months?
I think looking at the Jerusalem Post analyses is probably the best way to explore these things, or various different online platforms that can provide, I think, more informed analysis. my observation would be that we will be continuing to pursue aggressively the military campaign in Gaza. Whether or not we actually reoccupy, take over the territory, I think is still an open question. It'll depend a lot on what happens on the ground in the next few weeks. It's tragic, and I'm not going to comment on whether it's right or wrong as policy, because that's not what we're here to discuss. I get very frustrated with people who have kind of an absolutist view of what is the best way to bring our hostages home. I hold Hamas responsible. I think this hashtag "bring them home now" drives me nuts, because the hashtag that I use is "release them now" or "free them now." It's on Hamas to release the hostages. It should have been the demand of the entire free world from October 8th.
Sure.
Um, and I do get frustrated with people who suggest that there's any easy answers. I do find it tragic that we're still discussing trying to get 8 out now as opposed to the full 59 who are maybe 25 alive, maybe another 25, 30 bodies. It's a disgraceful and tragic and incredibly difficult and painful situation that we're in. I don't have any easy answers, but I'm sure that the government will be continuing to pursue both sides of the equation, the negotiations that continue on. I think Hamas just rejected the latest proposal by Egypt, which included the demilitarization of Hamas, and surprised there that they're not going to agree to that. I mean, from my perspective, I think that the geopolitical concerns that have driven some of the decisions by this government, meaning our relations with the Biden administration and the Trump administration, our relations with Europe, and what have you, have led us to agree to things that we perhaps otherwise wouldn't have or shouldn't have agreed to over the course of the last 18 months. Certainly since that first ceasefire, both enabled Hamas to rearm and achieved only the release of a minority of the hostages. But it's very easy from our armchairs to say what we should have or should or couldn't do. You asked is what do I predict, and I predicted the government will continue on the ground with an aggressive military campaign. I will predict that Europe and America will continue to pressure, as Egypt and others are doing, will continue to pressure Israel to negotiate, release prisoners, make concessions in order to convince Hamas to release a few more prisoners. I believe that this painful, anguishing situation will continue. It's clear that the families that are involved will continue to, very understandably, call for more concessions. It's clear that strategic thinkers will continue to advocate for a stronger military campaign, and that's where we are. We're going to see a continuation of the situation we're in, I would say, for the next 2 to 6 months, until at some point, it could be the Trump administration will give us the backing, because they have until now much more strongly than any other Western government. Maybe there'll be a new government in a European country or Canada or what have you that will also back this, for Israel to simply go and take over Gaza for a limited period of time and just go and find the hostages and destroy Hamas, as we've been talking about for so long. But it's not going to be easy, that's for sure.
Yeah. And you point to the anguish of the situation, and of course, the degree of anguish for Jews around the world and human beings who are sympathetic to the Jewish people, of course, is shocking and enormous. And of course, we think of the families of the hostages and the hostages on a daily basis, and recognize them now as well. I wanted to ask, in terms of European governments, would you say that Germany is the government that has shown most support for Israel in terms of strategic and tactical support, or would you say there are other governments in Europe that are especially supportive of Israel at the moment?
So obviously, it's very hard to answer the question in general. I would say no, Germany has not been the most supportive. I would say Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, other countries that unfortunately have lived under and suffered under, whether it was the former USSR or even today, the threat and the actual, obviously, attack in Ukraine and Georgia before that by Putin. um, those governments and those people who have elected those governments are much more responsive to our both military and existential issues. Germany has been, as it always traditionally is, more supportive than some of the other, I don't want to call them anti-Israel, but more hostile governments in Europe. I mean, there are some which are anti-Israel, the Scandinavian countries in particular, and certain governments in France and Britain and elsewhere, in Spain, that have been very hostile to Israel. I don't call them anti-Israel because I think it's important when we talk about these things that our definitions are very accurate.
Yeah.
Somebody who's anti-Israel doesn't believe Israel has a right to exist or a right to defend itself. Most of Europe believes Israel does have a right to exist. They would prefer that Israel not take actual steps to defend itself, and therefore it's a problematic definition. But
Mm.
if you want to say pro-Palestinian, all of Europe are pro-Palestinian, but then again, we have to redefine what does that mean? Because I don't believe they're pro-Palestinian. They're not working for the benefit of the Palestinians when they support the Palestinian Authority and Fatah and Arafat and Abbas and of course Hamas. But okay, that's a whole different conversation.
Mm.
Germany is
Yeah.
supportive as always is in the sense of being sensitive to its responsibility to help support Israel and its ability to defend itself.
Mm.
But it has also come out with problematic statements about
Right.
Israel's use of disproportionate force or too many civilian casualties in Gaza, etc., which is obviously a patent absurdity for any of us who
Mm.
follow these issues and research the actual numbers and saw what
Mm.
America and its allies did in Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone back in World War II. So there's a lot of unfortunately hypocrisy and
Yes.
Germany has not been as strong as it could be, but it has been stronger than
Right.
certain of Europe.
That's right. It's all relative when it comes to support for Israel in these different countries, and as you said, the double standards that we see Israel being held to across so many different levels are very clear to see. I wanted to turn to the topic of anti-Semitism. Obviously, we've seen a rise across the Western world and in other parts of the world, including in Australia. I'm just wondering if you have a message of support or guidance for our community here in Australia.
Well, I'm glad you asked because I remember you mentioned that towards the beginning, and I do think there's an important message that has to be heard and isn't heard often enough. Um, there's a statement by the Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Lusatu, who wrote one of the pillars of Jewish kind of moral philosophy, called The Path of the Just, and a number of other works. He says in the beginning of that work, nothing I'm going to say is new. I have no kind of new inventive interpretations or statements to make, but it's very worthwhile to review the kind of main parameters, the pillars of our faith, as it were, um, frequently in order to remind ourselves. So here I want to say something that's nothing new, but it's very important to kind of I call it, we have to reassert the legitimacy of Zionism. I was involved with all my work on campus at one point with a number of groups who said, well, we can't, Hillel at one point, Hillel International at one point said, we don't do pro-Israel programming because we have to be here for all Jews.
Right.
And there were groups like that said we can't use the word Zionism or Zionist in any of our materials because that's a dirty word. And
Mm.
so and this is based on something that I worked on with Nathan Sharansky, the idea of reasserting the legitimacy of Zionism, the legitimacy of the foundation of the legitimacy of Israel, even just in the language we use, we have to take back the banner of Zionism. We have to take back the legitimacy of Israel and not allow it to be a dirty word. And to a certain extent, we've done that over the last 20 years, many leading Jewish and pro-Israel groups. But I don't think we've done enough, and certainly not on the grassroots level. What do I mean by that? I mean, for instance, a term that's come into greater use in the last decade, but still doesn't really have its prominent place in our online or in-person discussions, and that is this idea that the land of Israel is the ancestral homeland
Mm.
of the people of Israel. The idea of indigenous rights, which of course today we have land acknowledgements in Australia and America, which are very, I don't I don't denigrate that. It's an important element of recognizing the historical injustices that have been carried out against Aboriginal peoples, obviously in Australia, but across the world. I think it's a very important part of our modern society.
Mm,
Um, I'm not going to get into the hypocrisy of those in America who acknowledge the land rights or the land connection of Native peoples, but then do nothing to help support their reclaim of those rights.
mm,
That's a different topic. But my point is this: that Abby even said at one point that Zionism is nothing more or nothing less than, and this is a paraphrase, than the return of the people of Israel to its ancestral homeland and this reestablishment of our sovereignty in our homeland. And this connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel, and the idea that Judaism is a civilization that combines culture and religion and language and land, is something that we don't reinforce enough, either in our education of our own youth or in our dialogue with others. The idea that we could be an occupier in our ancestral homeland as the indigenous people of that homeland has to be much more prominent in our discourse. This doesn't mean for a minute, by the way, that you can't support the establishment of a Palestinian state. If
mm,
that is your view that the way to bring peace to our region is to create a 22nd Arab state and call it Palestine, then that's reasonable. People can debate that. I debate it all the time. In fact, I consider myself one of the strongest pro-Palestinian activists on the planet because I've always advocated for the Palestinians to have their own independence and to be led by leaders who care more about their own benefit, the benefit of their own people, rather than destroying another people, meaning Israel.
mm,
The
mm,
question of where that Palestinian state might be established, whether across the river in the original 70% of the original mandate for Palestine, uh,
mm,
that uh, that was given away illegally by the British mandatory power in 1922 to create the Emirate of Transjordan. That's another question, or in the territories of Judea and Samaria. Reasonable people can debate these things till kingdom come, but those same reasonable people can and must acknowledge the connection of the people of Israel to the land of Israel, which goes back thousands of years, and acknowledge the reality that the establishment of the state of Israel was the reestablishment of the sovereignty of the indigenous people in this region,
mm,
an area where there are no other indigenous people, not those who self-identify as Palestinian or any others. And then from that basis, Carolyn Glick used to be very strong about arguing this point. It's only from that basis that can we talk about perhaps Israel making concessions, withdrawing from territories, acknowledging the legitimacy of a modern, relatively recent creation of a distinct Arab identity called Palestinian, and look towards giving them some sort of independence in whatever territories make sense. We
mm,
have to acknowledge the historical reality of the legitimacy of the establishment of the state of Israel, the legitimacy of Zionism as that national liberation movement of the Jewish people, of the people of Israel. So that would be my relatively long-winded answer to your question of what people can and must do today, whether it's in private conversation with friends or business associates, whether it's calling to task college professors or politicians that mouth the calumny of Israel being created in sin or being a colonialist or settlement enterprise or an apartheid regime or all the rest of it. We have to stand strong in reasserting the legitimacy of the state of Israel and the legitimacy of Zionism if we ever hope to be able to be successful in overcoming the ideological battle that's being waged against us, which is how we kind of started our conversation. This
mm,
third wave of Zionist activity
mm,
of promoting and supporting and defending Israel in
mm,
this intellectual battle, which is let's make no mistake, it is a war. It's a war that is well funded and is absolutely intentional on the part of our enemies We can call and must call them that. They are the enemies of the Jewish people, the enemies of the state of Israel, the enemies of the Western world, and of the free world in its entirety. And therefore, that's kind of a topic we keep returning to in this conversation. And that is what we have to stand up and be counted for in all sorts of different forums.
No, I agree with you. The reassertion of the legitimacy of Zionism is a key message that we can reinforce in a whole range of contexts. And you mentioned the possibility of the creation of a Palestinian state if the circumstances also recognize Israel as an ancestral homeland, the ancestral homeland, sorry, of the Jewish people. I wanted to ask you about Palestinian leadership. We obviously understand that in recent decades, from the Israeli and Jewish perspective, there have been serious issues with the premise and the functioning of a lot of Palestinian leaders in terms of the PA and of course Hamas. Do you see any Palestinian leadership emerging that could potentially become partners, or is it too early to say?
Well, first of all, going back to the work that I did with Sharansky, I mean, I was privileged, as I said, to meet with and make friends with and still be in touch with some of the leaders of the call it more moderate trends in Palestinian society, civil society organizations, and individuals who are not focused so much on the Arab-Israel or a conflict or the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel as they are focused on building up a more moderate and tolerant and free society in Palestinian society. I posed the question earlier as to whether or not the emergence of that leadership in terms of taking over the governance of these societies is something that's going to happen in 2 months or 2 years or 2 decades. Unfortunately, at this point in Palestinian society, the same two trends that I described earlier are now basically in battle. It's not certain who's going to hold sway in Palestinian society. Those who were encouraged by the October 7th barbarity and therefore want to promote that kind of jihadist, violent, rejectionist ideology, or those who were so appalled by the savagery of October 7th that they rejected the Hamas and, for that matter, Fatah type of extremism and want to pursue a more moderate approach. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any recent Pew or BBC polls. Unfortunately, the latest one that I saw, which was before October 7th, demonstrated that the Palestinian society as a whole is the most anti-Semitic society on the planet, meaning they've been educated now for 20 years since the Oslo process, which is actually 30 years, but 20 years since the real establishment of the Palestinian Authority and it's taking over the media and educational apparatus of Palestinian society, to hate Jews, to see Jews as satanic, as the demon, as the apartheid occupiers, colonialists, stealers of our land, etc., religiously and politically and culturally, and therefore we really face an uphill battle in, call it, re-education, to use a Maoist term. But those leaders that you're describing and that you're asking me about, they do exist, and they haven't reached prominence yet. I have some hope that Mahmoud Abbas will not live forever. He's in the 24th year of his 4th-year term. There have been elections in the area since 1997, I believe. Or there might have been the one after that. But it's been about 25 years since the last Palestinian elections. And there's a lot of discussion of who is going to take over and who is going to inherit the mantle of being the chairman of the PLO and the president of the Palestinian Authority. I would not, if I was going to put money down, I would not bet on the emergence of a more moderate leadership among Palestinian society for the near future. But I still retain that same confidence I expressed before, that at some point the people who are looking to raise their families in some sense of safety and security, and to try and make a better life for themselves, that at some point this kind of universal aspiration to live in peace and to be able to support and provide for your own family is going to lead to the emergence of a more moderate leadership within Palestinian society as well.
Mm,
I just wish that we, all of us in the West and in Israel, were more insistent on encouraging and promoting those moderate forces and discouraging and rejecting the more extreme among them. It's one of the things that, again, going back to Sharansky, he credits the fall of the Soviet Union and the release of the Jews from the Soviet Union to Ronald Reagan's policy and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in 1976 of forcing the Soviet Union to reduce somewhat its oppressive policies against the dissidents in the Soviet Union. And by forcing the hand by trade agreements and arms agreements and what have you of that despotic regime to open up its society to more alternative newspapers being published and
mm,
what have you, led to the fall of the Soviet Union. I would like to think, and that includes also forcing them to enable more and more emigration from the society. We have the power in the West with all the trade and aid that we give to the Palestinian authorities. We have the ability to insist that they reduce the anti-Semitism in their media, in their
mm,
public pronouncements. We have the ability to insist the revamping of their educational system, and we have had certain times when we have insisted more, and certain times it's all there in the Oslo agreements and elsewhere.
mm.
And there are certain times when we've insisted more, and I believe we have to do more. But the answer to your question is, I would hope within the next half of a decade, we would see more of a moderate leadership emerging, but that doesn't mean that I'm confident in that, not in the current situation.
Mm.
Sorry.
Thank you for that comprehensive response. We've touched upon so many things in our conversation, from the legitimacy of the state of Israel and its right to defend itself, to looking at some of the key challenges in relation to Iran and its proxies in the region. And I appreciate how we've looked at depth at the Abraham Accords and the more modern interpretations of Islam that are gaining geopolitical prominence. And also the idea that we need to ask, is this a strategy or is this a tactic when we're looking at policy making, and really have a broad sense of how we can connect with allies in the region, whether they're other minorities or other state governments. Certainly, your experience in this field is second to none. It's really extraordinary having the opportunity to speak with you, and the depth of your understanding and the breadth of your understanding is really extraordinary. And I thank you for all the decades of service you've given to the Jewish people and the people of Israel, and the care that you take to elucidate the nuance in these situations and in the various relationships, and furthermore, the distinctions you make between predicting, which none of us can accurately do, versus stating, given all the factors, what you hope may occur versus realistically what may occur. You certainly have an incredible ability to synthesize a very complex region and very complex issues. So, Aryeh Green, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I've learned so much, and I sincerely thank you for your time today on Jewry Duty.
That's a pleasure. And thank you, Gemma. I think it went on a little bit longer than we might have anticipated, but it's been an interesting conversation. I definitely enjoy these more long form discussions than quick sound bites of 5 minutes. So thank you for taking the time, and let me wish you and all your viewers and listeners Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach from Jerusalem or near Jerusalem.
Thank you so much. Chag Sameach, Moadim Lesimcha, and I wish you all the best for the various tasks that you're doing to support Israel and the Jewish world. Thank you so much for your Jewry Duty.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. All the best. Chag Sameach.